Rebellious slave Nat Turner was caught, tried, and convicted. He was sentenced to be, as the judge said, hung until he was dead, dead, dead. Who was he? He was an interesting character, to say the least. Today, he would have been called a nerd. In a good way or a bad way. He had kind of a big, bulbous head, so everyone just assumed he was some kind of a genius. Well, he was in some way. He considered himself a religious visionary, maybe along the lines of Jim Jones or David Koresh. However, he was self-taught largely. He learned how to read. He read the entire Bible from cover to cover. But he was also a slave. The day came when a solar eclipse occurred. To him, he saw a black man's hand covering the sun. And to him, this was a sign from the Almighty that it's time to organize a slave rebellion. That's exactly what he did. Him and several dozen other slaves rebelled. Roughly 60 whites were murdered, many of them women and children. This happened in 1831. As I mentioned, he was executed. After he died, he was castrated. Some of his skin was used to make a woman's purse. So, fast forward to 1971, a very controversial Italian film comes out. It's called Goodbye, Uncle Tom. And in this, it depicts Nat Turner having an internal dialogue, and I read from it. I was looking for Margaret. She was hiding around the corner of the house. When I finally spied her, so I ran quick as the wind through the rows of corn. I ran through the bright sunlight in her hair. I ran faster than she, and then I caught up. I must kill you. Because I love you. Because you're white, 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 white. Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure as hell rhymes. John Brown was no slave. He was a white landowner. Today he would have been considered maybe a wacko, wokey, a social justice warrior. But he had a point. He was also against slavery. And he attempted to raid a federal armory and initiate the slave revolt. He was unsuccessful. He too was executed. But a lot of people still consider him to be a freedom fighter, a martyr. Some people consider him to be a terrorist. These are very difficult definitions to parse out. Guy Fawkes, in a different continent, was, you might consider, a Catholic terrorist. He attempted to reinstate Catholic rule in England. He attempted to blow up Parliament with a series of gunpowder barrels. That's where the plot name came from. Well, he was unsuccessful, kind of by a coincidence, but bad luck, you might say. Sure enough, he was tortured. He gave up the names of the other conspirators, and he was killed anyway. But even in his home of England, he's still seen as a rebel, fighting against the Anglo hegemony, fighting against the power. Some see him as a hero, akin to maybe Irish Republican Army leader. 1960, Waco, Texas. You have what was known to be the horror of Waco. There was a lynching of a young man by the name of Jesse Washington. He was accused of raping and murdering a young girl. He was also believed to be mentally incapacitated. He confessed to the murder, he was tried, and he was sentenced to be executed. However, as he was being led away from the courthouse, an angry white mob intercepted him. They kidnapped him from the jail officials. They drug him through the streets, naked, on the rough concrete. And over the course of several hours, they cooked him alive, for lack of a better word. And I bring this up because in movies, we consider lynchings to be maybe a punch-up, someone gets shot, or they're hung. But they were often very grisly, barbarous affairs, just ugly things to witness. Nevertheless, as he was being tortured, families gathered, and kids played. People had a merry old time. Now, what disturbs me is that the people who are doing this probably consider themselves to be upright Christians, civilized. But how can these things happen? East St. Louis, Illinois, 1917, same year. 150 blacks were killed. These were known as the East St. Louis Riots. And what was interesting about these riots is that the motivations were somewhat different. These were economic. East St. Louis was a boom town at that time, and this was also in the beginning phases of the great migration of blacks from the South into the industrial cities of the North. So this was a good place for a lot of the blacks who were leaving the South. The whites there were upset that the blacks were taking a lot of the higher paying skilled jobs that they felt were reserved for them. But what was also interesting was the fact that the whites too, these particular whites were also disenfranchised. They were largely Southern European and Slavic whites and new immigrants, almost entirely Catholic. That was an interesting dynamic. But what triggered this was the rumor that the local black men were cavorting with the local white women, and then all hell broke loose. It was the biggest riot in US history up until the Tulsa riots, which happened in 1921. So in 1989, I was a freshman in high school. I remember it vividly. And that summer, one of the popular films around was Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. And I remember it because it portrayed the racial tensions between the Italian Americans and the black Americans. And this all happened, kind of the glue that tied the plot together is the fact that this occurred on the hottest day of the summer. So that was kind of an interesting motif that they used for that. So let's fast forward to the days of the Houston riots. And we have Mexican day laborer Manuel Gerardo. Probably not that different from a lot of the day laborers we see today, a lot of the workers from Latin America and Mexico. He had just finished a back-breaking shift. And if you see a lot of these landscape workers today, that is hard work. Imagine how much worse it would have been 100 years ago before mechanization. So there's no doubt he had family in Mexico he was sending money to, so he was looking to cut his costs anywhere he could. He was living in a boarding house on Washington Street, which we now know as Washington Avenue. He was staying there. Presumably there wasn't a bunk for him. It was probably filled up by other laborers. So he was dead tired. He goes outside. He finds a bench, and he falls into blissful sleep. Right at that time, the Buffalo soldiers in Memorial Park started firing their rifles into the sky in a frenzy. Some of them aimed towards the close by houses. A bullet from one of the rifles launches, comes back down and pierces Manuel in the chest. He never opened his eyes. Shortly after that, those same troops gathered and they left Memorial Park. They were determined to rampage the city of Houston. It was nighttime, and they knew that they would have to avoid being spotted by the police or other military units. So they stealthily walked in the dark in between houses, in the ravines, and so forth. The local residents must have known a little bit about this because they turned off all their lights. They knew that something was going on. There were soldiers that were upset about something. They wanted to keep a low profile, avoid being caught any crossfire. Apparently one family, the Winkler family, didn't quite hear about this. So they saw soldiers approaching. Two young boys found it to be a curious thing. They turned on their porch light. They stepped outside. Immediately upon doing that, one of the Buffalo Soldiers got on his knee, fired. Nearly blew off the arm of one of the boys, killed the other one instantly. Fast forward a few months. After the smoke is cleared, there's a trial. 13 men are to be executed in San Antonio, Fort Sam Houston. 13 men are awaiting their fate. That's already been determined. Everybody was praying. Not a single person was not deeply in communion with the Almighty. There was a minister present to offer up any spiritual requests. Animi cruciatus. What do we need for that? Repentance. A love of God over sin and belief in redemption. These men wanted to be dispatched by firing squad. This was in line with their vocation as fighting men. That wasn't to be because the army chose to hang them. The morning was chilly. The guards turned up their collars. They looked like medieval executioners. Sure enough, the trapdoors opened. The men fell. The wooden beams above made a sickening cracking sound as these men perished. But at that time, even as their life faded, there was a letter sent by one of these men by the name of Thomas Hawkins. He sent it to his mother, and it read, "When this letter reaches you, I will be beyond the veil of sorrow. I will be in heaven with the angels. I fear not death. Did Jesus not ask, 'Where art thy sting?' Don't regret my seat in heaven by mourning over me. I can see dear grandmother and Miss Bessie Henderson, who I loved, standing at the River Jordan, beckoning me to come. I'm not guilty of the crime, but mother, it is God's will that I go this way. I will meet you at the river. This is the happiest day since Jesus spoke to my soul in Brookstone Church." Nice to meet y'all. Who am I? Jaime Salazar. I'm a practicing attorney. I'm also Latino. I'm glad to be here during Latinx Appreciation Month. You might think that I don't have a connection to the events here. Why would I be a person to write a book on this? That's a good question. I'm a lawyer, so I'm interested in justice by the definition of the work that I do. But I'm also a storyteller. I'm a father. And this story deserved to be retold. I hope I did a good job of it. So let's talk about black vaqueros. Vaqueros. You might use the word cowboy for want of a better description. Either way, these were the ancestors of the modern Buffalo Soldiers. What most people don't know is that a large percentage of the Wild West cowboys were African Americans, many of them former slaves. And they were known especially for their horsemanship skills and their lassoing. Very, very, very skilled individuals. So the U.S. Army, not coincidentally, decided that it would be a good idea to form these men into what's known as the Buffalo Soldiers. So they implemented 4 all-black regiments: the 9th and 10th Cavalry, the 24th and 25th Infantry. It wasn't initially called the Buffalo Soldiers. That name came about in an odd way because the Native Americans who the Buffalo Soldiers found themselves fighting with very frequently, they kind of saw these black men with their dark skin and their matted hair. They thought these were they compared them to the bison that they hunted. That's where the name came about, and obviously it stuck. Some interesting characters in the Buffalo Soldiers. One of them is Henry Johnson, who I'm looking at right there. Very interesting person. He epitomized what you would call a soldier of fortune. He was the man that just would not die. He was best known for his heroism, which earned him the Medal of Honor. The Medal of Honor reads, voluntarily left the fortified shelter and under heavy fire at close range, made the rounds of the pits, fought his way to the creek, and back to bring water to the wounded. Now, he won the Medal of Honor. He finished his term in the Army as a private. Why is that? Well, heroes are not always saints. So old Henry was always getting into fistfights, always committing some sort of infraction. So the heroes don't always fit the squared away stereotype that you would think of a proper U.S. serviceman. Another interesting and colorful person was a Buffalo soldier by the name of David Fagan. Now, he was born in Florida in 1875. He served with distinction in the Philippines. He saw skirmishes throughout his career, and unfortunately, he may have even participated in what would be considered war crimes. Voluntarily or involuntarily, we don't really know. However, this did change his sentiment towards the war. Instead of fighting for what he considered the white imperialist powers imposing their will upon another brown race of people, he decided he's going to switch sides. He defects to the Filipino army. He ends up becoming a general with the title of Generalissimo Fagan. And he leads a group of rebel ragtag soldiers who are just giving the Americans all sorts of grief. He was kind of what you would call the latter centuries Bin Laden or Pancho Villa, these individuals that just won't go away, and they're giving us all these problems. So we don't quite know what happened to him eventually. Some say that his head was delivered to the army brass on a plate. It's more widely believed that he found himself an attractive Filipino wife and spent his later years under the shade of a coconut tree. So that's probably where Mr. Fagan ended it. Now we consider the events just before the calamities. Houston's reservation, otherwise known as the Fourth Ward, was considered the black quarter for the city. At that time, there was two notorious policemen by the name of Danielle Sparks and Rufus Daniels. Lee Sparks and Rufus Daniels. They were policing the area. And they were known to be rather aggressive. They were white, and they did not have favorable views of the subjects that they were policing. They saw two young boys throwing dice, dice. They immediately give chase. Incensed, they're trying to bring these horrible criminals to justice. The boys run into a residential area. They can't find them. They think they're in the home of a particular woman. They rush in there. She's in a state of undress. They rough her up, humiliate her, arrest her. Obviously, she's upset. And at that time, another Buffalo soldier by the name of Alonzo Edwards, he sees what's going on. He's obviously upset. He doesn't like this at all. He tries to intervene. He tries to offer to pay the fine, to do whatever it takes, to go in himself. For butting in, he gets beaten up by the cops as well. He gets arrested. He's hauled away. Kind of a messy situation now. Word eventually makes it back to the Buffalo soldiers in Camp Logan that one of their men has been arrested. So a man by the name of Charles Baltimore, he's a corporal. He decides that he's going to go there and try to remedy the situation. So he manages to speak with the two officers that arrested him. They were not particularly pleased to hear from him. They beat him up. They injured him quite badly with a pistol whipping to the head. He comes unarmed, so he flees to safety. They actually fire their pistols at him 4 times for inquiring and trying to get his comrades out of prison. They eventually drag him away, beat him up, throw him in prison. This is where things started to move in a very bad direction. The rumor is that he was killed by the police. He wasn't killed, but he was badly injured, but he was not killed. However, the Buffalo Soldiers at Camp Logan believe that he was. This gets them into a frenzy. They are filled with rage, and they vow to seek justice. First Sergeant Henry Vida was the senior enlisted man, very well liked, very well respected. He was almost the perfect soldier. Even the white officers saw him as their go-to person in terms of discipline, in terms of enforcing the rules, in terms of being able to gauge the sentiment of the troops. So he was a highly trusted individual, a superb soldier in many ways. You could also say that he was conflicted. He was a conflicted person. He was also conflicted in his makeup, in his racial makeup. It's believed he may have been of mixed race. He was very light-skinned. His own men joked with him and called him mulatto. He was from Kentucky, so he wasn't a local. But nevertheless, he had the respect of his men. While these wild rumors are circulating, and after somebody suggested that there's a white mob going to invade Camp Logan, he was the voice of reason, saying, look, we need to hear the facts out. Let's not overreact. But because he was conflicted, at some point, for reasons we may not be sure, he flipped. He went from being the voice of reason to being the ringleader, motivating his men to march into Houston and to get their justice. So, he's buried in College Park Cemetery, which is not too far from here. And that's an interesting fact that I discovered. Memorial Park is a beautiful place. I go there a few times a week. We love the manicured trails, the crushed granite. It's a very popular place. Most people don't realize that it has a bit of a stained history to it. And it's interesting because when I moved to Houston, I knew bits and pieces of the story. I knew that something happened. There were soldiers that committed crimes. I didn't really know the whole story. And I think most Houstonians are in the same boat. They've heard of this, but they don't really know the whole story. And it was never really clear to me why that was the case. Those incidents resulted in the largest trial in American history. A century later, there would be the trial of the century, which was also for a black man by the name of O.J. Simpson. Different circumstances. However, the rioting occurred over the course of just one evening. It didn't last days or weeks. It was one brutal night, and it resulted in nearly 20 death sentences. One of the good things that came about it was reforms to the military justice system and a conversation about segregated military units and about race in general. Why was it forgotten? I don't know, but I've got my theory. I think black and white sentiment decided that they would just not talk about it. If you can pretend it never happened, we'll pretend it never happened. Because neither side really comes out looking all that good. It was messy. It was complicated. And it makes people's skin crawl. So if we can pretend this never happened, then maybe we'll just forget about it. That's my theory. Now, we consider the idea of a person's breaking point. Apply that to a group, a disenfranchised group. Did the black soldiers finally say enough? They'd been spit on, humiliated, tormented, discriminated all around Houston. It wasn't just at the camp. It was on the streetcars by the police. They reached the point where they said, enough. They sought justice. And in a dark twist, they did get some justice. One of the policemen, Lee Daniels, was killed. The officer was in the area, and he was in a vehicle with a few other people. They made the mistake of turning right into the Buffalo Soldiers as they were rampaging. He realized what the mistake he made, ran out of the vehicle. He had a pistol on him. He got hit by a dozen or more rounds from the military rifles of the Buffalo Soldiers. He goes down immediately. They didn't really know who it was until they approached him. And when they saw who it was, they bashed his skull in with their rifle butts. Was that enough? Should they have stopped? Should they have said, okay, we made our point. We got some form of justice? We don't know. What we do know is that the debate about blacks and guns is an incendiary one. Let's not forget the Ku Klux Klan existed to disarm the black former slaves. Were those black troops infantilized? And was this infantilization sometimes considered benevolent? We're doing them a favor. We're not letting them lead themselves. We're going to not allow them to be armed. They wouldn't let them carry rounds in their rifles. They thought that they were not capable of handling this kind of responsibility. So we're just going to take that out of your hands. The soldiers were seen as simpletons at best, buffoons at worst. And I'm sure that some of the powers that be felt that they were actually doing them some sort of a good. Now, let's not forget, that applies to situations today. We should always be cautious on how we see people, even if we're trying to do them some good. Over-policing was an issue that came about in the aftermath. Talking about the craps game, I mean, was that a reason that the riots occurred? Were the police overzealous in that? Thankfully, today we do have differing theories on how policing should occur. We have more of a community approach, and we've learned a lot from those days. Could that have prevented the calamities? Well, perhaps. Harm reduction, that's applied towards drugs and other sorts of vice. The idea that we're not going to stamp it out, we might as well try to minimize it and hopefully direct the actors into a more positive direction. Could that have helped things out? The Department of Defense was responsible for sending black troops into the Deep South. Houston was considered the Deep South, still is. Were they racist in sending black troops to what was considered to be a hostile city? It's easy to say that they were in hindsight, but I'm not entirely convinced. Would they have made the same choice today? Were they in fact not making the right choice by saying, look, racists be damned. These men are to serve where they're needed by the US Army. That's a way to look at it. Certainly after the rioting, you could say that that was a mistake, but I don't know if that's actually a fair argument. It all reminds me of the monumental book, The City of God, written in the 5th century by St. Augustine. What he talks about is the difference between the city of man and the city of God. The city of God is dedicated towards holiness, towards communion with the Almighty. The city of man is focused on gain, subjugation of others, profiteering, vice, short-term gain. Houston at that time was almost seen as the Athens for African Americans. It was seen as a good place to live. The economy was booming. Many blacks had very prosperous lives. The powers that be wanted it to remain that way. But then Jim Crow laws came around and it ruined everything. You could say that the city of God was corrupted by events. So Jim Crow laws, what we need to understand is that they were passed through legislatures. This wasn't an evil dictator that initiated these laws. They were passed legally, and they got through the court systems. If you're familiar with the case Plessy v. Ferguson, this will kind of inform you on how that process began. In fact, the Nuremberg laws in Nazi Germany were modeled after the Jim Crow laws because they kind of saw that as giving them a license to do the same thing in Germany. We saw what happened when those laws were implemented. Lawfare, that's what I would describe this. Lawfare, using the judicial system for evil purposes or as a means to destroy people that you disagree with. That still occurs today, and it shouldn't. It was bad then, it's still bad. We look at the great statesman of India, Mahatma Gandhi. What most people don't realize is that he grew up in South Africa, spent much of his life in South Africa, and he was a successful lawyer. He wasn't always wearing the flowing suits, the flowing saris that you see him in. He was very dedicated to the British common law. Now, all of that changed one evening when something very momentous happened to him. Does anyone know what that was? So, he was neither white nor black. He was what South Africans considered a colored person. He was on a train and he was forcibly removed by racist conductors. They humiliated him and he vowed at that moment, never again. Britain lost an entire subcontinent because they disrespected this man. Folks, if there are soldiers sworn to uphold the Constitution and to die for your rights, do not spit on them, do not disrespect them, do not degrade them. You won't like the result. Did the events occur because of a failure of leadership? Well, certainly, probably. The U.S. Army made the big mistake of sending its most senior NCOs to training in Iowa just before the Buffalo Soldiers came to Houston. So the NCOs, the non-commissioned officers that were in charge of the Buffalo Soldiers in Houston, were either inexperienced or just of a lower quality than what was the norm. Not only that, they didn't have enough support. They were sleeping in tents. Meanwhile, white officers were living in makeshift structures. As they said in the Deep South, eventually, slaves will burn down the master's house. Mass hysteria was not controlled. You saw ringleaders. Sergeant Henry Vita was one of these ringleaders. He was kind of like a Moses, leading his people out of the wilderness, but perhaps on the road of perdition. But there's no question that while there were ringleaders, there was a lot of coercion. There were men who testified that they were forced at gunpoint to participate in the riots. Many men deserted. They wanted no part of this. Many men probably thought that they would make their presence known, but that no blood would be shed. How do we deal with these situations? It's a very complex situation. Some people called the soldiers fifth columnists. The fifth column terminology came from the Spanish Civil War. So Francisco Franco, who was the dictator of Spain at that time, he was talking with one of his generals about what they were going to do when they march into Madrid. The general said that he had 5 columns already on their way. Franco says, I only count 4. Where's the 5th? And the general said, the 5th are civilians living in Madrid, and they will rise from within. Kind of scary if you ask me. Now, when it came to the trial of the Buffalo Soldiers, a difficult concept was discussed, and that is collective guilt. We all know what that is. And it's difficult because it's rarely used in a legal context. It's rarely used because it doesn't really jibe with our notions of fairness, impartiality, or justice. You're punishing an entire group for the actions of a few. It has happened before, and sometimes that might be the only tools you have available. Take a couple examples. Germany after World War I and after World War II. After Germany was punished post-World War I, you could argue that the punishments were so severe and they were so broad and they affected everybody that you almost guaranteed World War II would happen. The bad apples don't get caught. When you punish everybody, the real bad people, they go off and do their own thing. Blackstone's ratio is related to this. It's an old English common law notion that it's better that 10 guilty men walk than 1 innocent man is punished. And we live in the system, and that's a good thing. The people who came up with this were knowledgeable on human nature. Where did this come from? Does anybody know? The origins of Blackstone's ratio. It wasn't from Blackstone.
Isn't it biblical?
Thank you. Well done. Well done. If you can find but 4 just men,
The city is saved.
may you save the city. Abraham, I think he was the world's first lawyer because he argued against God, and that's kind of tough, right? He argued with God, and a couple times he changed God's mind. So Abraham is credited with that, and he did all that without even going to law school. That's where it comes from. So the actual trial itself was very problematic. And this is where this is the reason why we still dedicate a lot of effort to the events that happened over a century ago. Over 100 men were put on trial. They were represented by one advocate. And I say advocate because this person was not even a lawyer. He taught at West Point. He was assigned to be their lawyer. Now, anybody who has any semblance of legal process, or maybe they know a lawyer, they know that preparing a case for that many defendants in roughly 3 weeks is insane. It just doesn't happen. All right, this is ridiculous. That's the situation that they were faced with. Secondly, they were dealing with an antiquated military justice system, which didn't allow for appeals. The deck was stacked against the Buffalo Soldiers from the very, very beginning. So why is the military justice system different? And to basically summarize, it's different because you're dealing with different things. There's different things at stake. You might say that a young boy who takes the family car and has a couple beers is considerably different from somebody who disobeys orders and launches missiles on a city. The stakes are very different. Not only that, but the standards of evidence are different. The standards of proof are different. So that's why you have two systems which are purportedly seeking to fulfill the same end. I would compare it to a criminal court and a civil court. For example, O.J. Simpson was tried in both the civil and criminal court. In the criminal court, he was deemed not guilty. In the civil court, he was deemed responsible for the wrongful death. Why is that? Because the different standards of proof. Different standards of proof. If a person's life is on the line, you better darn well be sure that they are guilty. Very high standard for proof. And that's kind of what we had in the military justice system. Some of the other things that made the military justice system difficult for these men was the fact that there's generally a lack of independence. Okay, it's all done within sort of an initiated core of Army officials, Navy officials, or whatnot. That can be problematic. The punishments are often very widely. And of course, there's not a lot of civilian oversight to the process. The one silver lining that did come out of this is that the military justice system was reformed considerably after the trial of the Buffalo Soldiers. A lot of reforms were made. Today, the military justice system continues to reform in its own way. But the biggest reform came in Order Number 7, and that dictated that any death sentence can and should be taken up to the President of the United States. That came about after the trials of the Buffalo Soldiers. For some men, it was a little bit too late. So what's happening today? Down the street, you have my old law school, South Texas College of Law, and you have a handful of professors who are doing great work with regards to the Buffalo Soldiers. Of the many convicted Buffalo Soldiers, they're trying to get pardons. Reinstatement of rank. Honorable discharges. It's a lot of work, but there's a lot of energy and will to do this. And the law school is doing great work. There's even a clinic at the law school which allows students to work on these types of cases. They're getting help from the military academy at West Point. Law students there are also assisting. So there's a lot of activity going on with this. We might see something happen perhaps in this presidential administration or the next one. So what did the riots do for black advocacy in general? Well, if we go back in history, Frederick Douglass, brilliant genius. He was brilliant because he fought discrimination by challenging Americans to live up to their own ideals, to live up to the Constitution. You say these nice things, well, show me. And as a lawyer, that's the most effective way to argue a point. After Frederick Douglass, you had different voices. Martin Luther King, he used a spiritual Christian approach. After Martin Luther King, you had Malcolm X. He used a slightly different approach, maybe a slightly more militant approach. And then if you've got the recent voices today. You could probably say that black advocacy has become a little more hard-edged, a little more militant. And there's no question that it was motivated in part by the events that happened in Houston 100 years ago. When a group of men said, enough, we're taking arms, we're not taking this anymore. The NAACP came to being, or came into prominence at this time. Prior to that, the largest chapter was in New York City. During the trials of the Buffalo Soldiers, the Houston chapter rivaled its chapter in New York City. And it's probably still the case today. History rhymes, and that's unfortunate. 100 years ago, a couple soldiers were beaten up by policemen. You had riots. A couple years ago, a man was detained by police and he died. I wish that wasn't the case. We talked about a mutiny. We talked about the resulting rage. But let's not forget two other things: atonement and forgiveness. Thank you.
We can open up the floor to questions, and we're not using a mic, so we can speak freely.
Oh, yes, I actually have two questions. Oh, my name is Kel Carter, and the first question I have is that when we tend to talk about the Houston riots, it's the assumption that there was only one black regiment that was at Camp Logan. I was trying to do some research, and I came across mentions of another black regiment, the 370th Infantry Regiment, being there as well. And what's kind of interesting is that the 370th is in a way similar, but also the polar opposite of the 24th. The 24th was a regular Army unit, had black enlisted, mostly white officer corps, whereas the 370th, that was originally a black National Guard unit from Illinois, had some black staff officers, and they weren't full-time, so they weren't professional soldiers. My core question regarding that part is, are there any records about how the soldiers from the 370th felt about the 24th, basically going and conducting the mutiny? Like, was there any documents showing that the soldiers felt empathy for the soldiers, or did they look down upon them for essentially breaking the code of soldierly conduct? That's the first question. Then the second question is, can there be any parallels drawn between what the 24th Infantry did Houston in 1917 to, say, for example, the Phoenix Massacre that occurred in 1943 with the 364th Infantry Regiment in Phoenix, Arizona, or the Townsville mutiny that occurred with the 96th General Service Engineers in Australia in World War II?
Good question. Good question. There is some data, some accounts that parallel your first question. And actually in my book, I talk about Cadet Flipper. I forget his first name. He was the first West Point cadet who was African American. He did not have nice things to say about the 24th. He considered them renegades and scumbags. So there's good reason to believe that perhaps there was some animosity between these two groups. A lot of the factors that you mentioned probably were relevant. The National Guard unit, again, this was not a completely professional unit. Some of the black soldiers there probably had day jobs or other careers. So they were less invested. And of course, they were also living in the northern cities, which were very different. So I think that had a factor to play. Unfortunately, not all the black units had always been cohesive, and there's good reason to believe that there was some animosity. There was also, in the aftermath, a lot of black voices that were not sympathetic with the Buffalo Soldiers. They said, they should be treated like any other traitors and dealt harshly by the Army. That's an unfortunate thing, and there's reason to believe that they were not on board with the events. In terms of, I'm sorry, your second question, remind me.
So the second question was, can there be any parallels drawn between what the 24th Infantry Regiment and the Houston riots, or the Camp Logan mutiny of 1917, to the Phoenix Massacre in 1942, like 1942-43 with the 364th Infantry in Phoenix, Arizona, as well as the 96th General Service Engineer Regiment that was deployed in Australia in 1942.
That's a good question. And I don't have enough information on those subsequent riots to really talk about that. I will say that, thankfully, in the United States, mutinies are extremely rare. Whether that's from good leadership or just a sound military structure. The mutiny that kind of comes to mind when I think of these grand projects is the overthrow of Haiti, of the French powers in Haiti. That was essentially a military mutiny, and it was successful at that time. Now you could argue today whether Haiti is in a better place now than they would have been had that not happened. We don't know. Yes, sir.
So I also have a two-part question. So, as you know, 1917 was during World War I. And of course, we know that the British soldiers, the French soldiers during World War I also mutinied to a certain degree in the trenches as well. Were there any sort of legality that tied like what the Americans were doing with their mutineers to the same thing as the Europeans were treating their mutineers as well in the front lines, such as, you know, this stacked up, this rigged military justice, I guess you could say. And the second part, the question I have is, when it comes to your book, the sources that you select, was there a process in which you filtered out which sources were more important than the other sources, or how did you evaluate which sources were I guess, more impactful
Sure.
to the narrative that you wanted to portray?
Sure. Sure. Hey, with regards to your first question, I think these were different scenarios. There's no doubt that the European powers lost more men during World War I. You could say that the conditions that they fought under were far more difficult than the American doughboy, who came into the war somewhat later on. And you could also argue that deserting or mutineering, after you've been in the mud for months, maybe a year, with trench foot, under constant fire, and you're undergoing shell shock, that's probably considerably different, and you would get a much lighter sentence than if you were stateside and you just didn't want to fulfill your tasks. So I think that's something to consider. Different, and of course, different countries in Europe had different sort of military systems. I'm not quite sure if they were harsher or more lenient. I do know that they tended to be rather harsh, and rightly so during wartime. There wasn't a lot of leeway for this kind of thinking, and because the stakes were just too great. Your second question, my gosh, please summarize your second question. The sources, yes, the sources. Well, I don't know if I was lucky or unlucky, but there's not a lot of material on the Camp Logan riots. There isn't. Thankfully, there is, but there isn't. There's a lot of court documentation, and if you got a couple thousand man years to go and sift through these pages of transcripts, go for it, right? I was lucky enough that there were a few good works that were very comprehensive on this. A Night of Violence by Professor Haynes. That's kind of the gold standard for the events that happened, and I used a lot of his material in my book. Thankfully, there wasn't a lot of material that conflicted. So I had the luxury of not having to adjudicate between which version of events I would take. But I will say that in my book, I tried to make it shall we say, a book for people who are not legal or historical nerds. Many people who read it, they said they read the whole thing in one sitting. So I left out a lot of the minutiae, or some of the things that might not be all that relevant or interesting in that sense. So I don't think that I'll be so lucky with my next book or anything that comes my way.
What is your next book?
You'll have to ask the publishers. I wish I could pick and choose which books get published. That process is rather tricky. But I've got a couple ideas in the pipeline. I'm also a practicing attorney, so you're feeding an army with an eyedropper, it feels like. And whenever I get a chance, if I got a little time here and there at the end of the day, I'll try to do some writing or work on a book proposal and roll the dice. That's kind of the life of the writer, but it's a good life. I enjoy it. And I'm glad I was able to crunch out this book while I was working and while the United States was shut down and while cities were being burned. So this is a labor of love. There's no doubt about it. Yes, ma'am.
So one of the reasons we invited you is because, of course, you are Latino for Latinx Heritage Month, but I want to ask, why is it important for us as historians, scholars, educators, to have intercultural conversations, right, like this? Like you are Latino talking about Black history. Why is this so important for us to do that? And you as a lawyer as well, why would you mentioned a little bit of the reason why you did it. Can you expand a little bit more on that?
I'll quote from the Bible, because there's nothing new under the sun. We keep repeating the same mistakes, right? Whether it's with one particular demographic or the other. We seem to be doing the same sorts of things and making the same mistakes. So learning from this, talking about it, having discourse is the best thing we can do. And of course, as Latinos, we are what you might call the other minority in the United States. And some people think that maybe we're getting short-shrifted when it comes to our issues, our gripes, and our difficulties. So an intercultural work like this, I think, will only help speed that discussion up. I tell people very frequently that I am ecumenical at my core, and in a religious context, what that means is you want unity amongst different Christians, and that's how I view the world, striving for unity rather than division, and that's my goal. Thank you.
Thank you everyone again for joining us. Thank you, Jaime Salazar.
Thank you.